Hello and welcome back to this demo for the Idealistic Crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and this commentary track will be for the 1993 masterpiece, Batman Mask of the Phantasm, produced by the same cast and crew behind the legendary masterwork Batman the Animated Series. The film was released to theaters on Christmas Day 1993 in a very limited release with almost no backing or advertising by Warner Brothers' theatrical division. So it pretty much came and went and really began its cult following on home video, which was the original intended release when production was started. And the feature was just supposed to be a direct-to-video animated feature made after the first season's 65-episode run had concluded. Over the years, as more and more people actually got to see the film and the audiences eventually found the film that they were not able to do on its original, very rushed, haphazard, limited release at the end of 1993, the film quickly garnered a following of diehard Batman fans, and of course fans of the animated series as well, for its depiction of the early days of Batman and Batman's more human side, thus giving you all of the great elements of the origin story without doing the origin story, and of course focusing on the characters and their emotional context for each individual story element, and really getting across the heart of the character of Batman and the world of Gotham City while fully embracing the mythos of the Batman universe, which the animated series had done so beautifully that most people, myself included, really do consider it, and I really do consider it the definitive adaptation of Batman that the world has ever seen, of which Batman Mask of the Phantasm is really the perfect distillation of all the ideas and thoughts and concepts that the entire cast and crew of the animated series strived so hard to get into the animated show. So with all that out of the way, that's my little brief introduction, let's get to the actual film itself. If you want to view the film along with this commentary, please go ahead and go to whichever version of the film you're going to be looking at, whether on disc or streaming. Go ahead and cue it up to the 0-minute, 0-second mark, which should be some black screen leader right before the animated Bugs logo with the Warner Brothers shield. That way we can get in roughly the same place. Now, as with all my commentary tracks, these are not professionally recorded, so please do bear with me if the sync isn't exactly perfect. There will be some frame discrepancies between different versions, so since we're all not looking at the same version, we might not be on exact sync, but by doing a count-in, I found it's the best way to get pretty close, so you should be able to keep up with the discussion if we're a few frames off. Now, go to your copy of the film, again cued at the 0-minute, 0-second mark, and we'll do a brief count-in. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. So we open on the animated Warner Brothers shield. Bugs will take out and take a bow. And that ends the usual type of animation feel before opening on these CGI opening titles into an entirely different world, a world of mystery, darkness, and brooding hidden emotions, the world of Batman Mask of the Phantasm. For the next 76 minutes, you are no longer in a theater, but you are inside the world of the Bat mythos in Gotham City, really an version and an experience that no other film has ever captured. So the story by Alan Burnett credit is very important. Alan Burnett, as one of the original showrunners and main series producers on or I should say story editors on the original series, he came up with the whole story concept for Batman Mask of the Phantasm and really has a knack for coming up with original concepts. And then, of course, due to time, he had to get together some of the great series writers to help write the actual screenplay. So they basically divided it into acts with Martin Pascoe, Paul Dini, and Michael Reeves splitting up the acts, but based on Burnett's original outline. Now, this CG opening sequence was an original idea of Eric Radomski's to try and do something a bit different, and perhaps if it had worked well, they could have used more of it in the series as a time-saving measure. But of course, this was the early days of CG. It was very time-consuming, very expensive. This was a nice showpiece and actually was the particular element that convinced somebody, an executive at Warner Brothers, to suddenly turn this originally direct-to-video feature film into a theatrically released feature, pretty much at the turn of a dime. So it was a nice piece to show off the film, but now is clearly the most dated aspect of the entire film, because once you get to the actual animation, it's a more nuanced version of the beautiful animation in the animated series. So it's now the CGI sequence that sticks out like a sore thumb. But it's still beautifully done, but it definitely clashes with the rest of the feature. What's beautiful about the structure of Phantasm, even though everybody likes to talk about all the flashbacks and the very film noir-inspired feel of the structure, is that we immediately are allowed to open with this very dynamic little action sequence where Batman busts the counterfeiting meeting, but there's still the requisite elements of humor, the human elements that are so frequently lost in a lot of the more modern comic book and especially Batman adaptations. I hear the classic gag of stepping on the table to further knock the guy out. But then we immediately are introduced into the main plot of the film with the first appearance of the Phantasm and all of the shadowy, mysterious, scary horror elements that are so prevalent in the film. But all of this is happening in the first 5 minutes and is giving us the entirety of the main plot thrust, but also with a much darker tone than anything that we had seen on the animated series up to this point, which again had already finished its first 65 episode run of the first season. Now, this, of course, is because this is a feature film. And even though it was originally intended for video, that meant it would have gotten a PG rating on video. So it's not having to deal with the broadcast standards and practices that the show did, that the creators and the entire creative team, especially the producers, really felt as their, not really their enemy, but it was their greatest concern, what they could and couldn't do. So, of course, throughout Mask of the Phantasm, if you compare it to the animated series, you'll see the stakes are much higher, characters are bleeding. As you see here, immediately there's blood on somebody's chin. They really do feel the impacts a lot more. Gun usage is a lot more prevalent because this is a feature film. But again, you do have to keep in mind this was originally designed as a direct-to-video feature, and that meant it was essentially going to be a bigger version of, say, a two-parter episode, but without the episode constraints. So it runs 76 minutes, a little bit more than if you put 2 or 3 episodes together, but without the TV standards and the sort of framework of a TV episode. It's allowed to play out much more at a filmic pace. And it's all these little moments here, like Batman examining the glass and finding the first stages of the residue before seeing his first glimpse of the Phantasm, that allow the movie to further establish the world of Gotham City. It allows the viewer to really get their head into the Bat mythos and to really live in it. So you feel the impact of what the characters do a lot more because it feels like a fully realized world. This is something that the best of the Batman films do, such as the 1989 Batman film with the incredible Anton Furst designed Gotham City, but in animation, you can go a lot further because you don't have to deal with regular practical facts. Now, again, everything here is an extension of the animated series, and particularly everything after the first in the first season. So we get all these beautiful bits of inherent humor with Bruce and Alfred in the Batcave that shows that Bruce is still a human being, even though he is Batman. That is something that you usually see in a lot of Batman films or adaptations, that they get in going for the gritty darkness that has been the more in thing to do in the past few decades, that they generally lose a lot of the humanity of the Bruce Wayne Batman character. Now we're introduced to more of the key players in a very stylized but straightforward manner. Again, very reminiscent of classical film noir, which was a lot of the inspiration for the film and something you see a lot of people talk about, particularly in the flashback structure. Burnett said that his influence was primarily Citizen Kane with its usage of flashbacks, which is true, but I think you can stretch the noir influence even more to films such as Laura, which is all about flashbacks, or the iconic masterpiece Out of the Past, which has some of the greatest flashbacks in all of the genre. But of course, the series itself was already influenced by many things, and the creators and the whole team regularly pulled from all over in terms of Batman's comic history, which is why it is really the definitive adaptation of the character, because it understands that Batman can exist entirely in a dark realm, that you have to balance the light and the dark, you have to have requisite elements of humor, you have to balance the more adventure, daring-do elements of some of Batman's inspirations from the classical golden age of pulp fiction, along with the more brooding, dark detective material. And Mask of the Phantasm, because it is a perfect distillation of all of what the animated series team was working towards, is really the best representation of that we've really ever gotten. And it does so, all of this, in a remarkably brilliant way because it only has 76 minutes to play with. So here in this scene, we see the emptiness of the Bruce Wayne persona life, and indirectly how it weighs down on Bruce, the internal secret person inside, how he jostles around with the society dames and the political backstabbing that goes on. Again, further tying Arthur Reeves, the character, into the story, and now going into the setup for the first of the flashbacks. And it's driven by emotions and Bruce's own memories that are triggered. And of course, he does this while going to and staring at the portrait of his parents, the real representations of his internal struggle, his guilt, his pain. And so we frequently see Bruce in front of figures of his parents in portrait form or at their tombstones, we see here in the first of the flashbacks. So it's the notion that his parents have never quite left him, but now they're just essentially representing his own internal demons. Now, it's really interesting to look at what they do with the flashback sequences, with the character designs, with the performances. If you look closely, Bruce is obviously drawn a bit differently. His hair is a bit different. His shape is a little bit different because, of course, this is before he actually becomes Batman. This is essentially taking place after he's done the world traveling and he's prepared himself to do this crusade. He hasn't hit upon the full idea yet. But this is allowing us to do the origin story without going through having to see the Waynes get killed again and do all the tropes of the origin story. So in that sense, it's allowing the audience to have their cake and eat it too, because you're getting to do all the fun stuff of an origin story, and it's so beautifully written and staged and put together that you don't have to go through all the cliches of the origin story. And meeting Andrea Beaumont here for the first time, this is the main thrust of the original idea that Burnett had. And I'm glad he said this because I always felt this way, that this whole film is actually about a particular thing. And he did confirm that, this is essentially the last temptation of Batman, sort of a play on the last temptation of Christ, that the last temptation before Bruce Wayne leads his solitary crusade of a life as Batman is that he could have a happy life with Andrea Beaumont, who is, for me, probably the best love interest that has ever existed for Batman, because she's so perfectly balanced out against Bruce's own internal demons and his background. And of course, the tragedy of the story is she is and ultimately becomes the dark reflection of what Bruce becomes, that the Phantasm is the dark reflection of the Dark Knight himself. So here is perhaps the most classical part of what most Batman origin stories would do, the first night sequence or the first night out. This is Bruce making his first attempt as a crime fighter and realizing very quickly that, it works to an extent, but he doesn't have the means at which to scare people. So, of course, in the comics, this would lead to the classic panel of the bat flying through the window, and criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot. I shall take the form of a bat. But we don't get any of that stuff. We get the practical reasons, and it never insults our intelligence by telling us these things outright. We are allowed to see this stuff happen and how the first elements of the Batman we know are already here, but it's not quite there. It's not fully realized. The rough edges have not been polished off, and this is the impetus for Bruce to do this. But this first success is going to be, sort of staved off a bit by the continuing idea that he could have a happy life with Andrea instead. Now, I should mention and point out that even there, the brief little one-liner, this is still a person with a sense of humanity and a sense of humor. This is a Batman that is fully rounded. He is well-rounded as a character and as a concept, which is, again, something that does tend to get dialed down or lost in a lot of the more gritty adaptations. Some more fun nods. We get not just the early days of Bruce trying to be a crime fighter, but here in the car we see the younger patrolman version of the series' regular detective, Harvey Bullock. So again, this is having all the fun stuff of an origin story, seeing all these characters and these situations in this world that we're used to seeing a certain way, but seeing everybody in a slightly different light, and then saying this is how they got to the typical place we know them from a couple years down the road in the main series. But again, we're getting to do this without all of the standard cliches of the origin story. We don't have to see every last element, but we get just enough to put us in the headspace of where Bruce is at this point in his life. So it's probably a good place to mention that the sound design of this film is really important, something that doesn't often get mentioned. Now, the actual designs, the animation and everything is an extension of the regular series, and they use several of the main studios that they used on the animated series for the film. So it doesn't have, extremely fancy, highly crafted animation that, actual animated features with extreme budgets or, say, a Disney feature around this time would have had. That's not the genesis that it had. It was originally designed as a direct-to-video feature film that would have been released on VHS and Laserdisc. But because it got earmarked for a theatrical feature release, I have to interrupt myself by the newspaper here, the little joke, Radomski to press innocent. That's a nod because, of course, the producer and director of this film is Eric. Well, one of them is Eric Radomski. There's one or two nice little nods, but I had to interrupt myself with that there because it always cracks me up. And of course, Alfred here has black hair because this is a flashback. It's the lovely little touches like that that really sell the sequence. But to, again, talk about the sound design, they actually spent a longer time as if they were doing a theatrical release mix, which is what they did, than what they would have done on the actual series. Bruce Timm has said in interviews that they would have spent maybe a couple hours or a day or two mixing an episode, and that would have been in stereo primarily. They were matrixed Dolby Stereo tracks, but because it was television, it wasn't really, that engaging outside the main stereo channels. But this mix in Dolby Stereo is far more detailed and nuanced and has a texture to it. There's a low end, there's a quality that just further draws you into the world, and it is a sign of the greater nuance and texture that this feature has over any of the first or second season episodes. It has more of the big screen gloss. You have the first of the Alfred walking in on Bruce and Andrea renewing acquaintance jokes. And of course, it's interesting that the end of the flashback ends on a note where Bruce was truly happy. One of the few times in his existence that he is, which is probably why it haunts him so. Now, of course, we go into the second sequence, or I should say the killing of the second gangster. And this is done in a way to further draw us into the mystery that is being told, because we don't necessarily know who these characters are when we first see them, and it's allowed for the audience to discover, and as the plot unfolds and everything plays out over time, with the usage of heavy atmosphere. And again, I think it has to be noted the greater degree of detail and nuance that's in all of the animation and the staging and the storyboarding of this film. And of course, The entire team was putting more into this because it was a feature and they could go further. They didn't have to worry about standards and practices, but you can just tell the attention to detail and the care that went here, and everybody was really pushing their talents and their abilities and their budget to the limit. The film did have an extended budget once it was decided to go into a theatrical feature of $6 million. And again, for a film that was originally intended as a direct-to-video feature, that did help a lot of things, but it also still wasn't the biggest budget in the world. Again, on a more technical side, I should mention the aspect ratio issue, which has confused a lot of people over the years. But thankfully, on the new Warner Archive Blu-ray, both versions are included with with a note explaining it. But essentially, because this was intended for video release, it was originally conceived in the 4:3 or Academy ratio, just like the rest of the TV animated series episodes. It was released to VHS that way as the original format was intended, but since it was decided to go into a theatrical release, they had to reframe everything in the animation stage into a 1:5 ratio, which was the standard theatrical release ratio for non-scope films. So that means the team had to go through each board and each shot and make sure it was framed to an extent where information wasn't lost and it would work okay in a 1:5 frame. It also serves to give a more theatrical feeling to the film, which combined with the more robust and nuanced Dolby Stereo sound mix really adds to the grandeur of the film, even compared to the already fantastic animated series. It definitely feels bigger and more cinematic. It has that cinematic gloss, but when you look at the composition, it is very obvious that some shots are, a little bit cramped. And when you compare it to the 4:3 ratio version, it's pretty clear that that was the original intended framing, and you don't have to deal with the shots that feel cropped in that version. That they're not, that nothing's really cramped there. But on the other hand, the widescreen presentation does give more, again, of that cinematic feel. So I always find myself torn which ratio to watch now that we have the ability to choose both on the Blu-ray version. The Laserdisc was also letterboxed as well, and that's the version I watched for a lot of years. So I usually still go back to watching the letterbox version simply because I'm so used to seeing it that way, and I did actually get to see this film in theaters. I was very young. I pretty much just begged to go see it because it was Batman. And it was, again, very limited. And I know I'm one of the few people who actually did see it on the original release, even though I don't remember a whole lot about it, simply because I was extremely young. And again, it was Batman. So I had to see it because it was simply Batman. But I do have some impressions and slight memories of seeing it, even at that young age. And I always do find the letterbox presentation, it adds something to the experience. So again, from a historical and technical perspective, the 4:3 ratio is technically better and was the original intention. But they had to protect everything for the 1:5 ratio, and the 1:5 ratio does have more of that larger scale feel. But it's up to you which version you prefer ultimately. But that's essentially why there are the two versions, and thankfully the Warner Archive presented both on their beautiful restored Blu-ray release. Another interesting thing that I've always found striking about the story structure is we have the concept of the Phantasm and Batman is being blamed for the crimes, but it's never allowed to take the main story focus away from the character arc and the emotional struggle of Bruce Wayne and Batman in this film. In some ways, you can maybe say it takes a back seat to that, because that the emotional journey and story of Bruce is the film. The Phantasm is merely a catalyst. And it's really interesting because the idea of a doppelganger causing the hero to get blamed for events going on is a classical story going all the way back to the golden age of Pulp Fiction. Pretty much every hero character has this type of story happen at some point or another. Batman's had it many times. But it's interesting that it's not allowed to draw away from the emotional story. Now, Andrea's been reintroduced, and pretty much discovers who Batman is simply by putting two and two together, and is not, the usual type of comic character who can't figure out someone's secret identity when it's staring them right in the face, which again is a great sign of her strength of character and why she is such a match for Bruce Wayne. Of course, one of the great influences on the entire team in making the animated series were the legendary Fleischer Superman theatrical short cartoons. And those had a lifelike quality and elements of what were becoming film noir before the genre was even fully recognized. And of course, that is all over Mask of the Phantasm as well. But it's not simply copying their style. That's not what the crew was after. They found a beautiful way of making their own style on the animated series, carrying over into this film that built upon what the Fleischers were doing with making, superhero characters come to life and comic books come to life. Especially with this panel here, the incredibly brooding shot of Batman spying through the in the rain through the binoculars. This takes us into our second flashback where Bruce is probably at his most optimistic. So of course, his and Andrea's date is to the Gotham World's Fair, the most optimistic thing to possibly ever existed. It's so optimistic that it's beyond belief, and it's definitely rather cheesy. So this is definitely borrowing heavily from the classic New York World's Fair and from a lot of Disney materials, things like the Carousel of Progress, which is pretty much being directly referenced in here with the House of the Future and the animatronics and the little robot dog and the very dated futuristic look of what the future could be in terms of the general lifestyle. But I love the added touch here of his old life. No, but his life as Batman still doesn't leave him alone because he catches sight of the concept car, which is very obvious the first stage and the basis of what will become the animated series Batmobile, right down to the lines being identical. So already in your head, with one glance from Bruce and one throwaway line, you're already thinking, okay, so when the World's Fair closes, he buys this, this concept car and redesigns it and paints it, and that's how it becomes the Batmobile. And he comes up with this whole thing, and that's how we get the Batmobile we know and love. So it's little layering in of little elements like that enrich the experience and make it interesting for fans or for rewatching this film, catching up on things that you didn't necessarily notice before. It's wonderful that we get to see Bruce's indecision, and it's natural, and it's allowed to play out with other characters. And none of the romance is forced because there simply has to be a love interest in a Batman film. This is all stuff that's happening naturally, and Bruce is essentially opening his dark shell and acting more like a normal person for perhaps the first time since his parents were killed. It feels alien to him, and you can see this in the performance. You can hear this in the performance and see it in the animation. But again, it's remarkable how all of this is very naturally done, as to not hammer any of the points home. Now, to go into the writing credits, again, we have several screenwriters working on Alan Burnett's original story idea. These were all the key writers, and of course, one, Paul Dini, being the main story editor of the animated series. And it broke down essentially that Alan Burnett came up with the story concept and wrote the original detailed outline, which apparently was pretty long. And then Martin Pascoe took essentially the first act. And then Paul Dini would take the second act, and then Michael Reeves took the third and final act. And then, of course, they would all discuss and tweak and rework some things. But simply due to time, they split it up that way. So you had three of the top writers of the series working on the screenplay and all their ideas coming together. This element is mirrored in the fact that all of the great directors of the series, of the first two or three seasons, really, did different sequences. So that's why they have their sequence credits. These are, guys like Boyd Kirkland and Kevin Altieri, who were, the mainstays, the top directors of the majority of the episodes of the animated series. They're taking different sequences. So again, you have this idea of the entirety of the crew who had been working every single day on those first 65 episodes of season 1. They had honed this to a particular rhythm. They had worked out all the kinks. They had filed off all the rough edges. They knew who their Batman was because they had done 65 episodes to this point. So this, as a feature film, is everyone getting to throw off the constraints of TV, getting to flex their muscles a bit, and to get further into the nuance of the animated series world they created. And it's interesting to see what they did with this, because it's not just that it's a flashback structure, but it's doing the elements of the origin and fitting it into their animated series world, again, without the usual constraints they had to worry about. So you get the sense that, everybody was maybe having a little bit more fun, but they were allowing themselves to be even more creative because they didn't have the typical constraints and they already knew what they were doing. So we have a Batman film without any of the major rogues gallery for the majority of the feature. That is, again, all about character and emotional context, which is absolutely incredible because there is no other Batman feature to have pulled off that feat. This also goes for Shirley Walker's incredible score with its particular themes for the Phantasm character, for Bruce, for Batman, and the wonderful main theme over the main titles. Apparently, her friend Hans Zimmer, the famous composer, did assist on some of the recording, and he does get a credit in the end credits. But this is a remarkable growth over the incredible scores Shirley Walker had already done for the first season of the show. But it is perfectly linked, like everything else in the film. As I've said, it is a distillation. The whole film is a perfect distillation of every single facet that went into the animated series. And now we come into what is the most emotional scene, not just in this film, but I think quite possibly in any Batman film, where Bruce drops all pretense and is pleading with his dead parents at their tombstone, actually admitting to them, but really to himself, because of course he is essentially talking to himself and his own demons, that he needs it to be different now. And it is just one of the most gut-wrenching moments of any moment of a character just dropping all pretense. And this is a real testament to the depth of Kevin Conroy's performance. This is the scene he always highlights whenever he's talking about what he sees in the Batman character and why he's continued to perform the role for decades by this point, and why he is the definitive Batman actor, because this scene is all about the human person underneath everything, underneath the costume, the performance, because all the pretense is gone. And it's at that moment that Andrea comes out and embraces him and shows that, she is his other half, that she understands his pain, and that's why she is the perfect love interest for Bruce Wayne. And even then, you still have the overbearing element of tragedy looming over, because of course this is a Batman story, and we know this happens in the past, and Batman obviously is not going to get in a relationship. It's not going to work out well because of course he has to become Batman. But it's this idea that Burnett had of this story being about the last temptation of Batman, that last moment where he could have some other life, a potentially happy life that is the greatest tragedy that he carries with him. And it's this element that as a giant James Bond fan, I can't help but it reminds me of Casino Royale, the Fleming original novel that started the Bond series, where Bond is almost fully formed, but it's the emotional events of that story that sort of crystallize and fully form the last necessary piece to create the James Bond character. Well, it does it for Batman here. Not to interrupt myself, right there on the screen, we see the mention of businesses where Batman's looking for associations between the gangsters. But if you look on the screen, it obviously says O'Neill and Adams, referring to the legendary Batman team of Denny O'Neill and Neil Adams, who revolutionized the character and brought back the Dark Knight detective, the multi-layered, highly realistic, and multifaceted Batman, and really redefined the character forever. And so it's great seeing these little nods and in-jokes. The banter between Batman and Alfred in this film has a little bit more pointedness to it than we get in the official original animated series. There's a darker undercurrent, but we still have the nice dry wit of Alfred, the wonderful Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. performance. It's really one of the most beautiful renderings of the dynamic between Bruce and Alfred, between Bruce and his surrogate father. Here we see Batman doing actual detective work, which is something we rarely see in the cinematic adaptations. He is, of course, after all, the Dark Knight detective. But seeing the photo triggers a memory and perfectly leads us into the next flashback. And it's great to see flashbacks actually done as if they are triggered properly by memory, which is, of course, how the brain works. But it adds a perfect dreamlike quality to the overall film. We are constantly going back. And if you notice, while there is a particular color cast to the film, it is primarily in these flashback sequences. Here in the flashbacks, you'll notice the skies are always very sunny, and there's a sort of warm amber tone to them that is, of course, completely gone in the present-day Gotham, where Batman exists. So this is sort of a visual way of heightening the dreamlike quality, in that it was a different time and Bruce was a different person, where he was potentially seeing another life. We get the beautiful shot here of the bats interrupting the marriage proposal, a perfect dark omen, but also setting up how Bruce and Alfred will shortly thereafter discover the first entrance to the Batcave. So again, it's perfectly layering in the origin story, but not hitting you over the head with it. I haven't mentioned it already, but of course, Andrea Beaumont is played by Dana Delaney, who was so great in this film that they brought her back to voice Lois Lane in the Superman animated series. And of course, she's so wonderful in this film and so charming that she could read the phone book, and I would pretty much melt, but as anybody should. But it already heightens the overwhelming sense of tragedy that hangs over their relationship. It is doomed. You feel it is doomed from the start. And there we saw our first glimpse of the Joker, who is a unnamed enforcer. We see the trademark nose and everything, but that's all we're getting from an origin story for this version of the Joker, which keeps the necessary mysterious background. It's the element of mystery that always makes the Joker more frightening. And so when you explain his backstory to a great degree, it robs a lot of that from the character. So I always appreciated how they explained how he was already homicidal with just him being in a certain place in a certain time. But again, it's giving you origin elements without hitting you over the head saying this is how this happened. It went from point A to point B to point C, and then you got this character that you know. So now Andrea has mysteriously rejected Bruce, and he realizes that his one shot at happiness is now over, so he rejects everything and goes back to his original plan. And now we come to really what has become the defining moment of the film, and really the single image that defines the animated series, staring at the cowl before putting it on for the first time. And it's Alfred's reaction to seeing the Batman, the Dark Knight detective, for the first time, that really sells this moment. We don't need to see the reveal of Batman it's the emotional depth of that scene. And what scares Alfred is not the costume, it's the lengths at which Bruce has gone to, that essentially he has now submerged himself forever in his own plan. So he has become something else entirely. He's become the realization of his life goal. I must say, by getting Abe Vigoda to play the third and final of the gangsters adds so much weight to the fact that this is a gangster character. It's such a nice touch, and he has such a lived-in voice that it just automatically sells so much of this character being a gangster. So now we return to the Gotham World's Fair, which is now essentially the piece of scrap metal that it was always destined to be once everything is forgotten. And of course, that means the Joker hides out there. Now, if you look at Joker in this film, obviously, they had to get some of the rogues gallery in here somewhere. And some people consider this, more of a cop-out. They could have kept it entirely about, gangsters and drama and not had any of the rogues gallery in here. But what I think is essential is that this is Gotham City, and the Rogues Gallery do reside in Gotham City, so it is natural for them to have connections with other characters. And the fact that this is giving us elements of a Joker backstory, and that this gangster is so desperate that he is going to the Clown Prince of Crime to help him. It adds to this world that has been created. Of course, the Joker would have connections to organized crime and to other people in Gotham outside the Rogues Gallery. And of course, even if he didn't, he is still in Gotham, so they would probably run into him or others of the Rogues Gallery at some point. Of course, it's now famous that the Joker was portrayed by Mark Hamill in the animated series, which is still an idea that boggles the mind, since we all have certain ideas of performers, but his range is absolutely unlimited. But if you look closely at the performance here in the film, it is a bit more nuanced again than the animated series, but it's a bit darker because they're allowed to go a bit further. Here, Joker actually kills people. He actually goes further than he does in the series, but he doesn't lose the whimsy and the clownish elements. And honestly, that makes him far scarier. And for me, this is my favorite Joker because he's not just doing all the wacky stuff, but he has absolutely hysterical one-liners and bits, and it's all in the way that he's reacting to what's going on while being his full-on Joker self, but also getting to do the full-on homicidal maniac stuff, which is right out of his first appearance in Batman #1. And it's the perfect balance of Joker elements, and he's not overwhelming the story. The Joker is a supporting character, and he sort of takes things over once he gets in here, but he doesn't take over the film, which is a very common thing that winds up happening anytime the big-name villains, or especially the Joker, is brought into any sort of Batman story, whether it's a film or whether it's a comic or a graphic novel. He also gets these wonderful dramatic entrances and exits, which again, here in this full frame close up, there is such an element of menace. Andrea realizes that someone, probably Batman, is already in the room with just a glance at the open French window, and is already starting to manipulate him by planting one right there, right in front of him, and just rubbing it in. It's all these little moments of character nuance that just really heighten the emotional turmoil they're in. And of course, the first time you see this, there are many things going on under the surface. You don't know what they are. But of course, once you see the film the second time, or after the reveal happens that Andrea herself is the Phantasm, it becomes much more obvious. And you see here that while she's putting up a really great front and gets a really deep cut at Batman, and of course revealing that she knows that he is Bruce Wayne, but she herself is putting on this great performance as she is in deep emotional turmoil and pain, and she doesn't like what she is doing, but she is compelled to do it out of revenge and vengeance instead of a tireless crusade for vengeance and justice. She is what Bruce could have become. And once you are able to read into all these other scenes, that way you're getting the full extent of the tragedy of this story, not just for Bruce, but for Andrea as well. It is a two-part story. It is about the destruction of not one, but two people. And it's not just the fact that they didn't get together and their relationship was never fulfilled. It's the fact that both of them have become entirely different things. Also, to heighten the mystery, they have Stacy Keach, who does the voice of Beaumont, the father, actually doing the voice of the Phantasm, which is furthering the notion that he has come back and he himself is the Phantasm. It's a great bit of misdirection to keep the mystery going. And then we get this wonderful shock reveal of one of the best Joker rictus grins on the dead face. And we get the wonderful Joker whimsy when he's prepared a death trap for Batman and now discovers that, of course, there is this other interloper who is interfering on his never-ending game with the Dark Knight. Now, Batman the Animated Series is well known for drawing on all aspects of Batman's comic history. This film in particular is not, like most of the series, is not specifically based on any one story, but a lot of fans have noticed similarities and said that it was most likely inspired by elements of the story Batman Year 2, which has a character known as the Reaper, very similar to the Phantasm, with a sort of similar back history and of course, commits crimes and commits murders, and Batman has to deal with this character. Burnett says that he was not aware of this story, or was not consciously aware that he was drawing on it when coming up with the original concept, but some of that is inherent, but it's really not an adaptation, as some have claimed. There are some similarities, but I think they're more natural ones. The film goes in completely other directions from that story. Now, there are some bits of Batman Year One in terms of some inspirational elements, because this is still, early in Batman's career, and also, we get bits of the origin story. But again, it's not doing Batman Year One. The closest we get to Batman Year One is this sequence we have here coming up, where Batman is on the run from the police and winds up in the construction site. It is very reminiscent of a similar scene in the Frank Miller Batman Year One comic, where Batman is eluding the police and is inside a building and there's an explosion and he barely escapes. So I think that was a definite definitely an influence on this sequence, but this is the closest we get to something out of Batman Year One. And what's interesting that they do here is they take it right to the limit. Here we see Batman in absolute crisis. He not only barely escapes, he's bruised, he's battered, he's beaten, he's bleeding, and of course is unmasked and in absolute flight for his entire existence. So we see Batman literally go to the absolute limit and almost lose everything. So, of course, knowing the reveal, Andrea must be feeling guilty as hell at this point because she's caused all this. And so that's why she drives out there to ostensibly rescue Batman. If you know the series well, this is also a little bit reminiscent of the first episode on Leather Wings, when there are some overzealous SWAT teams who cause a massive explosion and cause the whole building to explode. This was in the days where the Gotham police were making it much harder for vigilantes to do their work. Again, blood is something you do not see in the animated series itself. So that is the biggest telltale sign that this did not have the broadcast standards and practices constraints. And again, it's the level at which we see Batman have to sink to, the absolute desperation of this scene, which really heightens the drama. But he's always using his ingenuity, and we get the great gag here of his using the cape and cowl on a sawhorse to effect his escape. But that means the next time we see Batman, we see Bruce totally unmasked and totally about to be caught with no hope in sight. We see what is perhaps the first moment of fear in his eyes, and then suddenly Andrea appears out of nowhere as a sort of angelic figure. And then poor Harvey Bullock is not having a good day. This is a wonderful scene I've always enjoyed because it feels very lived in. Of course, Andrea takes Bruce back to Wayne Manor, and he's still in the Bat costume, and Alfred bandages him up, and they have a moment where they drop some of their armored walls. They become seemingly a bit more honest with each other, but you can tell not everything is there yet, and you can tell there is still some emotional distance between the two. And of course, again, once you know the reveal, you can read much more into this. So now we go into the next flashback, which feels natural. It never feels like it's too many flashbacks because everything is built up to, and we get the transitions that are perfectly done. They are triggered. Every flashback is triggered by a line, by characters looking at something, by the photographs of the past, triggering these memories, and then the stories are allowed to flow naturally. Now, the only question I've ever had for some of the characters in this film is when Beaumont decides that he and Andrea have to go on the run from the mob because he's taken all their money and isn't able to immediately give it back to them because it's tied up in other investments. My question is, if she's going to marry Bruce Wayne and he's the love of her life, why in the world doesn't Carl Beaumont ask Bruce Wayne for help? I mean, it would take a lot of hubris, and he would have to really lower himself, but it would be an interesting scenario for Bruce Wayne to find himself in, especially here, that to essentially save the love of his life, he would have to pay money to mobsters. It's an interesting idea, and it's just something I've always wondered. Why does Beaumont immediately decide, okay, yeah, he obviously does have to run. They obviously are going to be killed, and it is his fault, and he does feel guilty about it. But I've always wondered what would have happened if, maybe he should have just asked Bruce for a loan or something. That's just, something you think of after you've seen the film, dozens and dozens of times. And because you desperately want Bruce and Andrea to be happy, even though that would obviously mean there would be no Batman, and you have to have a Batman. But if you try to find that way out that Beaumont himself is trying to find, it's an interesting idea. But it's the only question I've ever had for some of these characters, and it's just an interesting idea of Bruce Wayne having to give a loan to his potential father-in-law to pay off some mobsters. And of course, there are many other James Bond parallels and Batman the Animated Series, and you definitely do. While there aren't any direct links, there are a lot of Under Majesty's Secret Service vibes in Mask of the Phantasm, with the lost, doomed love and the sort of potential father-in-law figure, where Beaumont has maybe a little bit of the elements of Mark Stracco, but that could be me just reading into it. But the whole team were all massive Bond fans, and you can pick up on a lot of little influences and nods to the Bond films throughout the entirety of the series. But I think they crop up here in the film as well. The earlier bit with Andrea using martial arts on Bruce to trip him, has a little bit of a Goldfinger flavor. Here they spend the night together, and we get a wonderful sort of romantic cutaway. So this is a Batman film with actual human relationships in it and doesn't shy away from the more adult things. And again, this was originally intended for a direct-to-video release, and this is a PG-rated film where people behave like real people. These are characters with real emotions. This is not a Batman who is devoid of emotions and just goes out at night and beats up criminals. This is a story that allows for these smaller moments. And that's, again, what accentuates the tragedy. And this is the point at which the flashbacks have now caught up with the main current day of the story. Now you see it's a beautiful sunlit morning. You see Bruce actually smiling. Yes, he's smiling because they obviously just spent the night together. But he's feeling some of that old happiness again, and you see here he's now feeling guilty about it. He likes the feeling, but it's still alien to him, and it's something he has shut himself off to now that he's been Batman all these years. So there's all these little pieces where you can just feel this emotional depth welling up, and you can just lose yourself in analyzing all these moments, and this is perfectly just hammered home by the incredible performances of the cast, all under the great direction of the legendary Andrea Romano, who did all of the voice direction and is really one of the great secret weapons of the whole DC animated universe that started with Batman the Animated Series. And now the mystery has its logical progression where Bruce realizes that it's not just gangsters, but it's other characters who were involved with Beaumont, and now has put two and two together that now this is going to involve the Joker. And so now this is where Joker re-enters the story with another incredibly powerful dramatic introduction. I mean, Joker's introductions in this film are works of art in and of themselves. And here, poor Arthur Reeves, even though we don't really like him, is not in for a good evening. And I love here that Joker is referencing his past, but he's obviously a different person. This is playing around again with the concept of Joker's origin, but it's showing that he's still a highly intelligent character. Everybody pictures Joker as the clown prince of crime, but they don't always picture him as calculating as he can be, which is part of why he's such a great villain and so terrifying. So here he's already putting the pieces together. He's already many steps ahead of Arthur Reeves, who is a bit of a dunderhead, actually, and he's having to lay out and explain things. He's already on to the fact that he's not saying it expressly here because we don't know the reveal, but he's already suggesting that perhaps Andrea is the Phantasm because he would know it's not her father because he was the one who killed her father. And I just love Joker being able to be wily and 10 steps ahead of people and being intelligently crafty and just coming up with ideas and cooking up things on the fly as he does here when Andrea calls. He puts two and two together and he goads Arthur on with this sort of staged conversation. Now here is Joker in full-on terrorizing mode. And of course, he's just given, essentially Joker venom to Arthur Reeves, but the staging, the scoring, and the way it is built up, there is an intensity here. It's one of the moments in this film that really does stick in the minds, especially of younger audience viewers. So the earlier reveal of the rictus grin is a definite shock moment that scares a lot of kids. And so does this moment where there's a much darker context to what is simply, again, Joker just using his Joker toxin on someone and causing them to laugh uncontrollably and go into hysterics. But it's so deeply felt that it makes you think that something else is going to happen because of this to the Arthur Reeves character. And this would actually happen in a later comic story, essentially the sort of follow-up mini sequel to Mask of the Phantasm that Paul Dini wrote for the Batman and Robin Adventures comic that essentially was the comic book of the animated series. So there is a Mask of the Phantasm sequel, actually, and the Phantasm has appeared in a few other places and is now being used in the comics finally again. Now, this scene is beautiful where we have the interrogation, but the stress of and the fear that Reeves has of Batman causes the Joker toxin to take effect. So he's struggling through the laughs. It's a completely different twist on the standard Batman interrogation, and it just works on so many levels because we're getting new information. Batman realizes just how nasty of a guy Reeves is, and he's putting two and together and realizing that Andrea has not told him the entire truth. So he's realizing in some ways that he's been duped. He's realizing the depths of Reeves's personal desire for political glory, and also that he's also having to deal with the Joker. I should also mention there was a comic book adaptation of the film as well as a very hard to find novelization by Gary Gravel, who did a couple novelizations of animated series episodes as well. The novelization has a couple little added extra bits, but not a whole lot. It's pretty much retelling the story of the film, and it's a good read. And the comic adaptation is fine, but it's a lot drier because, of course, it's a comic adaptation. It can't do the whole story, and it lacks the deep nuance of the film. All these little moments and little reactions and lines and things, like Batman looking at the phone and putting his thumb to his mouth in a moment of thought. It's that stuff that's missing in the comic adaptation. So if you've ever wondered, what this film would be like a little bit more straightforward, and you haven't read the comic adaptation, it's a really interesting comparison to make. And the fun here is we get the reverse of Joker's death trap. Now he thinks he's talking to the Phantasm, but he's talking to Batman this time. And of course, this is really the reveal that Andrea is the Phantasm because Joker is trying to kill her and directly saying that I know it's you because, of course, he would know he killed her father. We go from a beautiful Joker gag to this absolutely haunting reveal of Andrea standing in the dilapidated world of the future going into yet another flashback, but laden with so much emotional turmoil because now we have the reveal that she is actually the one who's been killing all these people and is on a mission of revenge. So here in the flashback, we are actually seeing the last time Andrea was a normal, perfectly rounded human being before the shock of finding her father's dead body, and completed by the beautifully dark gag of her father's killer picking up the dropped apple and taking a bite out of it. And of course, that being the original version of the Joker, we get a sort of matched gag here with the slicing of the bologna and then the very, very dark touch of the insinuation that perhaps the animatronic robot wife is more than a robot for Joker in the late, long evenings. So the Phantasm appears here, and then all of the theatrics that Joker alludes to immediately drop out because he knows the gag. So we get the Phantasm, but then we don't continue with the horror movie gags because everything is now out in the open. So she unmasks herself and takes on Joker directly, which is a really interesting touch because this entire climax is like a lot of the flashbacks where Bruce is emotionally laying himself bare. This is every character being laid bare, right down to the fact that Andrea is going to lose her gauntlet and realize that Joker is far tougher of an opponent than she thought she was going to be dealing with, because before this point she was really just knocking off older aging mob bosses. But if you look at the performance here, Andrea is now completely sounding like a darkly tinged, humorless version of Batman. She's tossing off an occasional one-liner, but without any sense of remorse. So you know that as soon as she gets the opportunity, she is going to kill the Joker. There is no doubt of that. And it's, of course, the absolute perfect place for this final climax to happen, that it happens in the abandoned world of the future. It is the physical realization of the dead hopes, the dead dreams, the dead possible future that Bruce and Andrea had. It is a physical manifestation of the bruised and battered and fractured selves they have become. So, of course, everything has to end here. It is the perfect fitting place. There is no other place where this could play out. It's hard not to get lost in the action because it is all emotionally driven. It's not just the fact that Andrea is about to fall into a giant propeller, which seems a bit bizarre to describe, but it is, of course, the emotional buildup that has led to these moments, and that this is not just about stopping the Joker and stopping Andrea from killing the Joker. It is about where these two people are at this point in time. So this is the point at which, even though Bruce is in a mask as Batman and Andrea has been unmasked as the Phantasm, this is the point at which they are finally honest with each other. And of course, the key line is uttered by Batman, which is quite funny coming from him. What can vengeance solve? And it's this point at which, even though he doesn't quite want to admit it to himself, he knows that she is lost to her pain. She is lost to him. And she knows that. She already knew that deep down, as did Bruce Wayne himself. That is the culmination of the tragedy of the story. And it's worked throughout the entirety of the film and hangs over everything. Not only is the film permeated with this dreamlike quality because of the flashback sequences and the fact that they're triggered by memory, but also the stylings, the stylings started by the animated series and its development of its own style known as Dark Deco. I have to mention the Warner Brothers shield there tucked in as an in-joke. It's the most visible of the in-jokes, but the whole team liked to do some things like that to keep things alive a bit. But I've also felt that in addition to the film noir aesthetics that the series had and the Phantasm really plays up on, you get that sense of tragedy between the characters of Bruce and Andrea, also in the fact that there's a whole sense of doom and of fate that hangs over the film in addition to it feeling dreamlike. So here in this battle with Joker, we get a very comic booky feeling appropriate setting of them fighting inside of a model city, so it looks like they're giants knocking buildings around. But there's also a darker context to the fact that Batman's just knocked out one of Joker's teeth and they're getting hit and cut, and Batman gets the nasty cut in his arm from a runaway Joker model plane. And here when Joker does the little aerodynamic move on top of the model subway car, model elevated train car, that's one of the best examples of the added sense of nuance, the greater degree of feeling that's in the animation because they had more time and more money to spend on this film as opposed to one of the episodes. But the sense of doom and fate can't help but make me think of, classical film noir, but particularly in the relationship of Bruce and Andrea being so completely doom-laden as the rest of the film is. It really makes me think of, some of the crime films and noirs that Fritz Lang would make in America, like the classic film Fury, or especially because I'm a diehard fan, I can't help but think of the death-obsessed poetic films that Val Lewton made and the horror cycle for RKO in the 40s, which definitely play into the whole Batman the Animated Series aesthetic. Now, right here, this is another of the elements that can't help but feel Bondian because, of course, Joker has a jetpack. And, of course, being a Bond fan, you can't help but think of the Beltextron pack from the Thunderball opening sequence. And again, here, there is this sense of desperation. There is some element of finality to this sequence. It's not just Batman fighting the Joker again. Here, Batman is now emotionally involved by what's been going on. He's not his usual slightly detached self. There is a different quality. And coming up is really, for me, what I feel is perhaps the key Batman line. A lot of people like to use the classic line from earlier in the animated series, the I am vengeance, I am the night. But for me, it's this here, whatever it takes. That is really just about, I think, the key line for explaining the entire point of why Bruce Wayne is Batman and why Batman will never give up and has a plan for everything. It's literally whatever it takes. He is fully committed to this crusade, as idiotic or as crazy or as unending as it may be. And even here, there's even a little room for humor at Joker's expense. And you see here, again, Batman is emotionally involved, but he knows that there's really nothing he can do. He knows he can say anything, but it won't matter. She is already gone. And then the last physical vestige of their possible life together is consumed in just an absolute fiery chaos, which is how this must end. It is, again, destroying the last physical element of the life they could have had together. The music builds to a crescendo as we get this epic final Joker laugh, complete with the missing tooth. And of course, they disappear in the final usage of the Phantasm's fog. Now, of course, how they actually got away and how Andrea and Joker somehow survived is explained in that Paul Dini comic. They essentially fall down the same sewer that Batman does, but get washed out to different places. But I really like the fact that we don't see any of that in the film. It gives, again, this it's a definite downer of an ending, which is what any great Batman story needs and deserves. That is the nature of the character. Then as the final explosion lights up the sky, we transition away, in a way much like the actual flashbacks. But here, Bruce wrestles with all of his emotions in the Batcave, where he's covered in bruises and bleeding. And here we get to see him reflect on how he couldn't save her. And it is Alfred, his foster father, who is his conscience, his guiding light, his real bedrock of maintaining his emotional sanity, which is what Alfred expressly, says in the dialogue, that he is afraid that Bruce would eventually fall into, and that Andrea is the physical manifestation of what he could be. Now, of course, In other hero stories or other classic characters, there is the love interest, and that could be a thing for them, but it could never be for Batman. Batman is not that type of character, and you can play around with that story idea, but it wouldn't feel right. It's not. It doesn't go with the intrinsic heart of the character. The character is a loner. He is devoted to his quest. He is not, say, for example, the Spider, the classic pulp character who was, essentially a derivative of the Shadow, who could have the neat event Sloane love interest. Just as he is not, Batman is not quite one of his inspirations. The classic character of the Phantom, who has the love interest character of Diana Palmer, which is perfectly done for that character, but it would not work for Batman. Batman is a character that is fundamentally different at his core. And so this bittersweet ending where we get the vestige of hope that Andrea is at least alive, that is the best possible outcome, because of course all that Bruce has, all that Bruce is the night, is the crusade. That it is a fight, it is a crusade that never ends, and that is the entire meaning and nature of the character, of the Bat mythos, of everything. That is Batman. To say anything else would be untrue to the character and to the world, and that is what Mask of the Phantasm does better than I think anything perhaps before or since. So with that, we go into the end titles, which starts first with the musical cue, but then we'll segue into what pretty much every film of this era of the 80s and 90s had to have, which is the end title ballad, which doesn't quite fit with, shall we say, the emotional intensity or the purity of the rendering of the Batman mythos in the film. It is. I said earlier, the CG opening credit sequence is perhaps the most dated thing in the film itself, but the end title song is definitely the most indicative of the era of which the film was made. And it's fine for what it is, but it definitely is it may be a tad jarring, to say the least, to go into this after the intensity of everything we've just seen. And again, this is a film that you have to see over and over. It's a film that grows, and it grows in your mind. And the more you dig into the Bat mythos, the more you're invested into the characters, not just in the animated series, but in the original comics. I think that only intensifies over time. It's a film that grew a cult following because it sticks in the mind, and it grows with each viewing, just as any classical film noir does. So this is the single most film noir feeling thing I think the animated series team ever did, and I think that's because it's the distillation of everything that Bruce Timm, Eric Radomski, Alan Burnett, Paul Dini, all of the classic names from the animated series team were after. They wanted to render Batman fully realized, but they wanted to pay tribute to every iteration that had come before in the comics and the character's history, and to go on their own path, but to make it feel intrinsically right. This is something that no one else has ever done before or since to the same degree, and that's why myself and most fans consider this the definitive Batman adaptation, and really the definitive comic book adaptation, and nothing else has come close. And why Mask of the Phantasm is so special is it is the perfect distillation of everything Batman the Animated Series is. I know I keep saying that, but it has to be said. That's why this film is so special, and that it dares to be more adult and about character and about emotional problems, and that Batman is also Bruce Wayne, and Bruce Wayne is a human being and has to struggle with this. Again, Alan Burnett started this with the idea being this would be the last temptation of Batman, and that is exactly what it is. It is a glimpse at a future that could have been and ultimately was not to be, and that is the tragedy of the destruction of these two people, of Bruce Wayne and Andrea Beaumont. And it's this emotional tie, this emotional complexity that makes Andrea my favorite love interest of the whole Bat mythos. And the closest thing to it really is the Bruce and Selina relationship and The Great Batman Returns. I don't know if that was an inspiration, but there's an echo of that there. But here it's made all the more explicit because we feel every single emotional nuance of each character, and it's something that grows over time with each viewing. So we get the theatrical credits here, the Pacific title, Dolby Stereo mention, and of course, pretty much no one except a few of us saw this film theatrically, and we all came to see it over and over and over on tape and Laserdisc and later DVD, and now the beautiful Warner Archive Blu-ray, which is a must-watch. That closes out the film. 1993's Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which again, I think is still unchallenged as the great Batman film, the film that so perfectly realizes the Bat mythos and the Batman Bruce Wayne character to such a degree that it remains unchallenged as the purest Batman experience outside of the comic book realm. It is an incredible film to go back to. And it is a film that even when you've seen it, dozens of times, it never fails to capture the mind and the heart and to fully invest its audience, whether you're a giant Batman fan or whether you have no knowledge of Batman's comic history or the Bat history or the Bat mythos. It never fails to invest audiences in the emotional story being told, because at its core it is an emotional human story above everything else, and that's the element that is necessary for any great Batman story or any great story period. If you're not invested in what's going on, if it's just a dude in body armor running around punching people at night, then there's no point. That's just another nameless vigilante. And that notion goes all the way back to, again, the golden age of Pulp Fiction. The characters that lasted, the characters that meant something, the characters that became iconic before comic books were ever a thing were the legends of Pulp Fiction. And these characters in the pulp magazines had these elements, the element of humanity and of character and of depth, even if it was more subdued, even if it was, say, the Shadow, who in the pulp magazines essentially created the superhero genre with the writing of Walter Gibson. And the Shadow is the primary building block of all superhero fiction, along with Doc Savage. But the Shadow is the primary building blocks of Batman. Batman started, very much as a Shadow inspired character, to put it very politely. But even there, all the great characters of classic pulp magazine fiction in the golden age, before comic books took off, those stories had these qualities inherent. And you can go back even further to classical adventure fiction, and of course to Johnston McCulley's creation of the Zorro character, which is the other building block of Batman, with Curse of Capistrano. That is a emotionally driven adventure story. It is about human qualities, and that is what inspires Don Diego de la Vega to first don the costume of Zorro. So that is fundamental to these types of characters. And I don't think anything has ever realized this to such a beautiful degree and told a wonderful story that is about mystery and fully integrating itself into the world of the comic book landscape, like Batman Mask of the Phantasm. No other film has done all of those things and so fully realized its characters to such a degree than this film, which only runs 76 minutes. And as I've said many times throughout this track, it is the perfect distillation of the entirety of Batman the Animated Series. Lastly, I would just like to say that Mask of the Phantasm ironically performed a lot of the same duties that Batman the movie did in 1966. Both films were made after the first season of their popular show. Both films were sort of dumped out in theaters, not marketed very well, did very poorly, but discovered a new life on television and home video, developed a cult following, and due to release histories, were really the primary ways of enjoying their parent shows for many years until their shows were eventually released on home video and released to the public again. So it's very interesting to note that sort of parallel. Both films are still, I think, underrated and not talked about enough. But for a series that still incorporated acknowledging Batman 66, but was still trying to distance itself from it, as many things did after the 66 series ended, it's very interesting to note that Mask of the Phantasm is like a direct echo of the Batman 66 theatrical feature film. And I think it's really fitting that it does this, and it manages to be the perfect reflection of and the opposite of everything the 66 film was. And both are the perfect distillations of what their shows were. The 66 film is perhaps the greatest episode of the 66 series. It's like the super episode, but without the television constraints of an episode format. That's what Mask of the Phantasm does, but on a completely different emotional level. So I think it's interesting to note the sort of parallels, and that's how I wanted to close this particular commentary track. So as always, I want to thank you ever so much for listening. Again, these are not professionally recorded, and I do my best to try and keep up with the film and keep up with my running thoughts and get across all the various, hundreds of things I want to put into one of these. And I feel I'm only scratching the surface. There's still so many things I didn't get to cover. So hopefully you've been able to enjoy this, or maybe look at the film in a different way than you had before, or hopefully if you're new to the film, you watched the film before listening to me babble over it. But I hope I've been able to provide some additional readings and context into matters, and I just wanted to pay tribute to what I feel is just such a towering work in the realm of comic book adaptations. I am such a lifelong fan of, obviously, the character of Batman, but the animated series was around in my formative years, and I can listen to any of the creative team or personnel of that series talk until doomsday and still not get enough. But this film in particular has always been very special to me because I've seen it many times, obviously, but the emotional context and the means at which it gets to a greater depth of realizing the human turmoil, the human side of the Batman character, and its embracing of classical Hollywood techniques and the film noir genre, and really hammering home everything the animated series was in one 76-minute feature. It's just a film that's always touched me on an emotional level, in addition to, obviously a Batman fan level and being a fan of the animated series. This is a film that I treasure personally, and I know many other Batman fans do. So that's why I wanted to do a commentary on it, because this is just one of those magical experiences where for 76 minutes, you are completely transported into the world of the Dark Knight detective. You are inside of Gotham City, and you feel every single nuance and every single emotional beat of the never-ending turmoil that is churning away inside Bruce Wayne as he continues the fight as Batman. And as Batman's crusade never ends, so will the crusade I am on never end. And as always, I am very humbly yours, the motion picture analyst.